Okay, guys, the question, I mean, let's address the elephant in the room. Why aren't Liz and Rishi quoting Fife's generation? I mean, with a cost of living crisis beginning to hit the 20 and 30 somethings of Fife, they urgently need help and support of the government and to help them get on the property ladder.
Good. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Yeah, pretty good, thanks. You know, I mean, the last few weeks we've actually been listening to the debates and the hustings of Liz and Rishi. Between them, they have told us how they're going to stop building on the green belt, slash taxes, outbid each other on the number of refugees they're going to deport, and push back against woke culture wars. But what are they actually doing for the 20 to 30 somethings of Fife? I mean, they're dubbed Generation Rent by the press, desperate to get on the property ladder. This is actually an open goal for any candidate to obtain more votes to be the next Prime Minister. But, yeah, when you think about it, it's actually the party that's voting for that person, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is a really interesting topic.
So technically, the people, the 20 to 30 somethings of Fife actually don't have a say in this at all, unless they're a member of the Conservative Party.
Yeah, and that's what makes it interesting today is because you've got myself, who's in their 30s, and Karen, who's in her 20s. So we are that Generation Rent, and we have, in recent years, joined the property ladder. So Karen more recently than myself. So we know the struggle about how to get onto that and what you need to have in place to do that. And what are they doing to help people on the ladder then?
I know. We've all been in there because I started off renting as well. You know, that's what kind of set me on my path to think, wait a minute, there's a bit more to this in terms of wealth and development and in terms of what you can do, because I began to saw that out the landlord that I had. Mm-hmm. But then it still means that we struggled to get on the property ladder. The only reason we got on, I think, was, I'm sure it was a 5% deposit we put down. Now at that time, our first house was £20,000.
I luckily got a 5% deposit as well. I wasn't so lucky that my house was worth £20,000 at the time. But
do you know how much my house is worth today? That same house actually went under offer, and it was 75,000. So literally within that time, it has gone up 3.5 times its original value from when we bought it. Now we bought it in the late 80s. Just about to the almost touching the 90s. I think it was 1987, 88. So we bought our first property in that time for that price. And 35 years on, it's gone up 3.5 times. What does that tell you about property investment?
What is it we say? Safe as houses.
Yeah, I defy anybody to tell me that property's not gone up over the long term better than any other asset class. Anyway, apart from that, there's only 16% of the 200,000 Tory membership is aged 18 to 34, whilst 47% of the members are aged between 55 and 74. Therefore, it's not a surprise that neither Liz or Rishi aren't even speaking daily about the cost of the petrol for the daily commute. Rising childcare fees, on the lack of opportunity for first-time buyers as well to purchase their own properties. For balance, just to point out what the balance is here, 16% of Labour's members are 18 to 34, 20% are for Lib Dems, and 16% for SNP. So there's no surprise, it's actually quite an equilibrium all the way through.
Yeah, it's quite the same right across all the parties. So, like you say, they're not going to spend time addressing subjects or topics that are going to be relevant to that age group, because that's not their minority. What is the minority? So, I think that makes totally sense to them, but I mean, it leaves people in our age group that are in that position totally out of the picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's probably a similar picture for me when I was part of the NLA, which is the National Landlord Association. I was the chairman
Yeah.
for Scotland. But what we found that most of the legislation and most of the press releases that came out were to do with the English housing legislation, which is completely different from Scotland because we're devolved. So every single time I had to go back and say to them, was that to do with England? Is that to do with Scotland? Because they always used to have this approach to say UK. And it's like, it's not the UK, it's England.
No.
England is not the UK.
Yeah, and we do get a lot of confusion from people with regards to legislation and compliance regulations and things related because they're looking at English law, whereas Scottish law is totally different. And Kieran, you're agreeing because obviously that's something that you'll see. We
So
see
even
on a
going
daily
out,
basis.
going out and meeting with new landlords, obviously you can pick up on that accent, and it is a different situation from being in England to being in Scotland. There's different regulations, different laws that we comply to up here. So it's making sure that you're making it clear to a landlord of what they will be held to in Scotland and what the regulations are. Even the leases, I think that's probably the biggest thing that we find is obviously there's no fixed terms in Scotland anymore. Or even landlords that maybe haven't rented a property out in a while. Obviously, we've had the change in the lease to private residential tenancies now instead of short assured. So it's been a big change, and trying to make sure landlords are kept up to date with all the new regulations.
Yeah, there's a lot of changes, and people need
Would
to
you
know.
say the Scottish Government's more progressive in legislation for housing?
I think so, yeah.
Or more draconian?
There's some things they're going a bit backwards on, but
or more draconian, or a bit of both.
I think it's quite hard for landlords because they have really clamped down on landlords in Scotland, and it's made it. We've seen obviously a difference, which I think is something we'll cover in the show, the way that it is affecting the housing market, because a lot of landlords are like, I've had enough, because there is so many more regulations that they're having to adhere to, and it is ever changing, and they have to keep up with that to keep compliant.
I mean, everyone's actually feeling the effect of of their household budgets with the rise in energy bills. So there's no doubt about that, because on the 1st of October, they're going up to 80% on the cap. And yet, when you think, even if it says 80% on the cap, that doesn't mean to say yours won't go up higher, because it's dependent on your usage. The cap's just a cap on the amount they can charge. But if you use more, they don't cap it at that. You have to pay proportionally for the amount that you're using. So this is a cap on the average bill, and they're talking about the average bill, but in actual fact, well, somebody like me, for example, I won't have the average bill because of the size of my house. So it's completely different to what they are talking about in terms of the monetary aspect. Yet, when you think about it, it's the younger generation, the generation rent, that have to cope with the frenzy of the rising costs of energy the most in that scenario. We all know, and I did that show yesterday with Zookla's statistics, that it's cheaper to, well, on the face of it, if you compare rent against mortgage, it's clearly cheaper to buy. But obviously, rental then gives you the options where you don't need to repair anything. The landlord has to do everything, and then you can walk away anytime you want. So you've got the flexibility of that as well, and you don't have the entry costs and the exit costs of beginning and leaving as what a mortgage does. And you're not tied to anything to have to sell anything later on. So that's probably where the generation rent actually, the advantages of that take place. It's easy for them to move. Classic example is, well, I always say to people, well, I should have just bought my house, or maybe I like my house. But then I kind of say to them, well, if you rented your existing house that you're in right now, that you own, would you continue to stay in it if you rented it? And quite a lot of people actually say no, they would move.
So that's quite a surprising one. You would think they would say, no, I'll stay, but...
No, but it just shows you a lot of people are just it's quietly content, if that makes sense. So they're quietly content staying where they are, and it's just not uncomfortable enough for them to say, I'm going to move.
Yeah. I think as well, and obviously not to disrespect anybody and things, but a lot of people are a wee bit thinking about commitment, and they feel less committed to something. Whereas if you take on a mortgage and you've got this commitment to make mortgage payments and repairs on your property, like you say, if you're going to exit, there's a big exit fee if you want. Whereas you're in a rental property, you've got that freedom. You don't have to worry about paying for repairs. If you need to move, you could move quite easily now with the notice periods and things. So it's having that I think that maybe makes people feel a lot more comfortable within themselves rather than being tied to something.
Yeah. If you're listening in or you're tuning in right now, please feel free to make any comments and chip in to the conversation if you want. But really, we're just talking about why aren't Rishi and Liz courting Fife generation rent? Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. I was going to say Truss, but she doesn't seem the person that you can trust there. I don't know what it is, but it just seems like somebody it's about. I don't know. Somebody that's a bit younger than even you guys, it's actually trying to run the country. When you have a look at her, it's like, what? Are you really? What experience does she have?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Whilst energy prices will affect all households across the country, younger and less affluent households are more prone to be disproportionately affected than those on the lowest incomes. That's the generation rent. In the financial year ending to the 2020, the least well off of 25% of households spent 5.59% on energy compared to 3.9% for the UK average. So that was a lot more. That's almost
a lot more.
It's almost about 60% more. With 2023 energy bills set to triple those figures, energy bills for those in the lower quartile will rise to around 16.8% of their household budget. My God.
That's a big chunkier budget.
How's anybody going to be able to afford that? Well, okay, so how's anybody going to be able to afford that? I mean, we had identified when I looked at the statistics, I provided them to Courier as well. I mean, I'm maybe taking their thunder away from their article that's maybe coming out. But actually, 15% of our income goes on leisure. So when you think about it, the leisure might be the first thing to go to cut back on, because it's usually, typically at times when it is tight, you usually go straight for the luxury items and leisure items. So that probably will be the budget that will suffer the most. Now, I actually talked about this and says, well, people lose their jobs in that industry.
We spoke about this, Jim, as well, privately.
But when you think about it, they'll just retrain for this type of industry, because the reality is we can't employ people for want of, for all the time. We're desperately trying to bring people on board, but you've got 1.1 million people chasing 1.3 million jobs. So there's a real good choice for someone to do that. So maybe that might actually be a better situation for the medium term for us. So let's look at the housing element generation rent household budget. You want to cover that, Ricky?
Yeah, so let's look, like average rent. So the average rental of a Fife property in the summer of 2020 was around £647 per calendar month.
Yep.
So, and then by the summer of 2021, it was up to around £702 per calendar month.
Yep.
And today we're averaging out at £786 per calendar month overall. So Fife rents are 11.2% higher than a year ago and 21.4% higher than 2 years ago, which is just crazy. I mean, that's the fastest annual rate of rental growth since records began in 2006. And the increase in rents isn't standard. Before 2020, I would have expected to see that kind of level of growth, maybe around about a 7 to 10 year period, whereas we've done it in 2 years, which is good news for landlords, not so much for Fife tenants, especially people at that lower end where obviously they do struggle with income, maybe lower incomes and things like that. They're priced right out of the market.
Do you think though, because I know this, we've just been a landlord for 30 years. Do you think this is just a realignment of the rental values anyway, purely based on the fact that rents have over the last...
They've not changed for a long
years.
time.
They've not changed much over the last 20 years. So do you think it's almost like the housing market? This is all now beginning to catch up and realign to what it should have been in the first place.
I do think that, like you say, I mean, since I started doing this over 10 years ago, there hasn't been any great change in rental prices. And rather than them being small incremental changes over the years, it seems to have just escalated over the 2 years and probably bringing us in line with where it should have been anyway. Some rental prices I do think are a wee bit high, and I think that'll level itself out, but I do think that's bringing us back to the new level.
The problem is, though, Richard, it's because we're getting it all at once. if we had a consistent policy of, you know, just maybe an extra £5 a month every year, then that might have been tolerable because people would have built that into their budget. But what we've done now is we've allocated all our money to different sources, and now we're having to go, okay, we're just going to have to rejig everything overnight now and actually take all that money back from different areas that we'd actually been using it on. Some of the areas you might know would possible because maybe somebody's bought a car. They've maybe bought a car and they've bought it on credit and they've committed to that.
Got other commitments,
mortgage. Yeah, they're committed to maybe not. I mean, when you say you're committed to a pension plan, sometimes that's a variable thing because it's all right having your work-based pension, which is fine, but sometimes you've got additional voluntary contributions which you make anyway. So that's somewhere where you can actually cut back on for the short term to allow that to go somewhere else in order to minimise the impact of the historic rise in prices for rents, for energy, and for food. So that's probably where I'd see that as well. But I mean, why have rents increased so much in Fife then?
Karen, I'll let you answer that one because obviously it's what we do every
on a
day.
day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
So really it comes down to there being fewer rental properties and existing Fife tenants are not moving as much. Obviously they can see what properties, for example, that, like you say, Jim, there's ones that have maybe been in there for a few years, they're on a good rent level and they don't want to move to an inflated cost is the way that they'll see it effectively. So they are quite happy just staying put if they've got a good landlord, a good property and a reasonable rent. So pro tips there on how to keep a tenant. But there are 1,220 fewer rental properties in Fife than 5 years ago. So this leaves only 21,633 private rental properties in Fife. Now, to be honest, that doesn't surprise me. It kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier on landlords are exiting the market because things have become too much for them to deal with, basically, in some cases. So obviously there are new landlords coming in, which is great. This next figure as well kind of surprised me because 9 out of 10 rentals come onto the market because an existing tenant has moved out. Now, looking at our figures, that's not the case. We have quite a few new ones, but the properties where a tenant is moving on does make up quite a good return on the rental market. Yeah,
that's quite interesting to see that 21,000, because if you look at the number of properties in Fife itself, there's about 160 to 170,000. So that makes us round about 14% of the Fife housing market in private landlords, and yet the UK average is round about 19.
Yeah, so we're just under that.
Well, that's a significant difference, Richard. That's about 5% of swing.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of properties, and that means a lot of people are actually. It's like what you said, Karen. A lot of people are actually they can't be bothered with the legislation anymore. It's too much. They're possibly selling up because they've now recovered in terms of the prices as they were before, because a lot of people held on to them since the credit crunch with the drop. Now they're beginning to sell because the market's recovered in the sales market. So therefore, owner-occupiers have actually gone up. So in that time, I don't know if it's we've discussed it here, but I know owner-occupiers in Fife in that 5-year period have gone up 9,000. So 1,200 fewer rental properties, but 9,000 owner-occupied properties.
Yeah.
So it's an urban myth that people would say all these greedy landlords are taking all these properties. They're not. They're not at all. They're actually there's fewer rental properties in Fife than there was 5 years ago. So, and as you said, Karen, it's leaving about 21,633 private rental properties in Fife.
And it is such an essential part of the housing market as well, obviously having rentals, because there are people that aren't in, like we've covered, they can't afford to buy, they're not in a situation to be able to buy. So having that private landlord sector is such an important, and I've heard that as well, like, oh, greedy landlords, and it's explaining to people how essential this market is in property, because there are people that effectively, if they weren't able to have a rental property, they wouldn't have anywhere to stay because they can't buy.
Yeah, Paul makes actually a really good point. That the way it'll end up is young folk moving back in with the family. Absolutely, Paul. I've told my boys, the Ben and Scott, I says, God, milk it for all it's got. Just stay here. Scott told me how much he had in the bank the other day, and I thought, holy shit, that's more than me. It's like, I need to charge you digs. Because I didn't.
You've obviously taught him well then, Jim, about saving.
Anything. Because it's like, but I'm kind of thinking to myself, blooming heck, I need to charge you digs. And then I checked with Ben as well, and Ben's like, oh, I've got so and so, and I went, what? Am I doing the wrong thing here? Could you boys not just buy a house and I'll just move in with you?
It's good that you've had that kind of supportive system, though, because I was the same. Like, we didn't get charged digs, but I was on the understanding that we were saving money. And thankfully, I didn't have to, not thankfully, but I didn't have to go into the rental market and spend that money on rent, because I can see how people get in that cycle of, I'm spending all my money on rent. I can't then afford to save up. And this living cost situation that we're in is going to make that even worse for people, especially first-time buyers. So they're not going to be able to get out of that rental cycle. And I mean, ultimately they've got a home, and like you say, they're not having to pay for the maintenance of it, which is a plus side, especially given the amount of work that I've spent doing this place up. But so, and it means that I've been able to go into use that money that I would have spent on for perhaps rent or digs to pay
For some instances, and I wouldn't like to coin it this phrase, but I've almost I remember people that were on benefits, and I was trying to get them a job, because that was what, that's the type of thing I do. So I was trying to get them jobs and stuff like that, and get them back on their feet and get them involved. But then when we worked it out about the fact of being able to get a job, and then the dramatic cut they had in what they were getting, it wasn't actually worth them working. For that situation. And some could say, well, cut them out completely, that's no right to do. But there has to be some sort of transition, because you have this huge impact that we're getting right now for everybody right across Britain, with this change in the amount of money you need in order to survive. And that's exactly what happened in their case. And I basically said to them, you're almost caught in a poverty trap. You can't get out of it, because you've not got enough. You've not got enough leverage in order to jump out of that poverty trap and get yourself at least on the bottom ladder, the bottom rung of the ladder, so you can continue to climb from there. So that's kind of how I looked at it. And this is kind of like what's happening to Generation Rent just now. It's a similar situation. Now, it's not for us to solve, it's for us to provide as letting agents and landlords. It's the government that should be trying to solve the situation. But as I said before, the only way to solve this, and one of the councillors jumped on the other day and went on about something, and I went, well, the only way to solve this problem, because Fife councils want to buy more properties off the private market, and I went, well, okay, but you're just going to do what we are accused of doing, is actually taking them out of first-time buyers' hands, or taking them out of an owner-occupier's hands, or taking them out of downsizers' hands. So that's what you're doing. So you're not actually providing, or you're maybe taking out of an investor like ourselves, who would actually rent it to someone who would need it. So you're taking out a tenant's hands. So the only way to solve that problem is for Fife Council is actually to build more new houses, social housing, and get back to an infrastructure building. And I think that's the only way to solve this problem as well. And in terms of getting people started, there has to be a cohesive policy by the government itself in Scotland to build social housing in order to help people on less certain incomes. Not getting this carry on about now. It's like, oh, you're qualifying and you're a great tenant or something like that, so I'll take you. But the guy's on about 30,000 a year. He should be buying his house. He shouldn't be. He shouldn't be renting off the council. The council's houses should be, or social housing and social housing providers should be providing houses not for mid-market rent, but for people to get started. That's my political bit.
But no, I totally agree with what you're saying, Jim, and that makes absolute sense. And I don't think there's a lot of people that would disagree. And if they do, then.
And if we allowed as a nation to build all these houses, to get all these people their starter, and even people that failed on harder times would then be able to afford these rents, and that will get them back on their feet again. And this will avoid this poverty trap that people are caught in for that reason. So it really needs to be sorted out on a national basis rather than trying regional. But councils still do have the power to do it themselves. Let's get back to it.
Well, to recap, obviously, because there is fewer rental properties and the asking rents for those are much higher than the current home, many Fife tenants are now moving, exacerbating the issue that obviously we've just been discussing. Now, today I looked at Rightmove, and there were only 52 properties available for rent in the whole of Fife.
Now, that's a complete difference, isn't it? Because that's a complete swing, because we have an oversupply in the sales market. And it was always a case that the sales market and the rental market would never be the same. You know, if one was an oversupply, one was an undersupply, and vice versa. And for a continued long time, we've had this undersupply in the sales and the rentals. But we've now got an oversupply coming in of the sales, but the rentals is even worse.
We're still under.
And when you think about it, that could be down to the fact that a lot of people are exiting. They're actually rental landlords.
Yeah, we've got a lot of new landlords and properties coming on, but not as much as maybe what's exiting.
Yeah.
So that could be a factor that's affecting that, definitely. I mean, I would have expected that figure to be, pre-pandemic, to be at least double. Do you mean that figure of available properties would at least be double that? So that just shows you. And obviously, and neither candidate, obviously talking about Rishi and obviously Les, that neither candidate they've been silent about the topic of ownership for the young. And Rishi has said that he will stop building on the green belt, but this isn't going to help the generation rent massively at all, really. And then Liz has
politically inclined. So, what is the green belt? You're saying it, and I'm like, I have no idea.
It's the part of land that's like the countryside, and you're not allowed to build on it. So what they're saying now is like we're going to open more of that land to develop.
They're going to start pushing out.
It's not as if it's going to cause anybody any problems, because there's only about 1% of the houses, UK households are only built on about 1% of land in the UK itself. If you put everybody concentrated, we'd all fit there. We'd all fit, in 1% of the land. And it's just by the very fact that we're so disseminated. But when you drive from place to place, look at the amount of countryside that's in between.
Yeah.
So what
we covered this last week, Jim, and the midweek show, you, Perry, and I, and we looked at the actual stats about how much land we actually build on and how much is available, and obviously, and then that was when we were doing the flats and apartment thing, and they're talking about starting to build more flats and apartments that take up less ground space than obviously keeping pushing out onto the green belts with all these new housing developments. So the stats on that were quite good.
Yeah,
yeah, that's it.
So it says actually, even though 1.2% of the country has residential property built on it, an additional 3.5% are gardens. Building houses is low density land use. Is it sustainable long term to continue to build that way in Britain, a country with a similar population to France, yet having less than half its land mass? So that's actually quite surprising when you look at that in terms of the numbers. So I don't see any reason why we would do that, why we wouldn't continue to do that or release some more land. The problem is, or the challenge we have to get over, is when you build more houses and introduce more people to a particular area, you then have to look at infrastructure improvements in terms of the doctors, the schools, the nurseries, the dentists. So you have to look at all that, and it's almost like one of these simulations that you get on. Well, the one
the Sims.
Called, the Sims, the Sims, or what was it, Sin City or something like that, the old simulator thing. So that's what they have to do. So often when we go, why do you not just build more houses? There is a lot more to it than that. There's also things like you've got to upgrade the gas system. You've got to upgrade I can't mind what it was called, but. What happened with us when I was helping run VZS Technical Ceramics as a financial controller, we actually had to pay, because we wanted another kiln in with gas, we had to pay Scottish Gas to upgrade the actual interconnector. We had to pay for all that. We had to pay £50,000 for them to upgrade the interconnector so we could get more gas to our feed. So that's another thing that has to be done. So it's things like sewage, it's water, it's gas, it's electricity. All that has to be planned out as well, and it does mean a huge upgrade in infrastructure.
You see a lot in the newer build schemes and things that they don't have things like Virgin Media doesn't run to them until about a few years down the line once they're completed, because they obviously have to run all that, and sometimes it's a wee bit delayed. So then sometimes internet speeds aren't as good. I mean, obviously because fibre optics through Virgin. So you notice that, and it's like you say, Jim, it's not just building houses; it's the infrastructure and the amenities to support it.
It's as well though, they'll build these new developments and obviously they have these lovely new houses, but although they have an affordable housing section in it, it's not affordable housing, it's association housing. So effectively here it's kingdom housing. So
Affordable.
there's no scope for first-time buyers to be able to buy in these developments. The only way
Absolutely.
it affects them is these people that perhaps have been in what would be their first home are upsizing into these developments, which then gives either first-time buyers or investors the chance to go in and scoop up the homes that they've come out of. But that's the only way that well, in my opinion anyway, that these developments help first-time buyers is because they free up.
Well, this is my argument about sometimes about, they do have, say, the social housing element, and it's a housing association that's got it as part of that deal. But the housing association tends to cherry pick. And I can say that quite openly, and any housing association come up against me, because I'll ask you, how much have you met the criteria of your requirement for the allocation from Fife Council? And I would say you've never hit that criteria, because Fife Council, as a result of affordable housing and them getting grants, the social housing providers, the Scottish Homes, and I think it's in Dundee still, they actually give them the grants. But the grants are on the provision that they give a certain percentage of the allocation of referrals from Fife Council to the people that are allocated from Fife Council. And they've never, as far as I'm aware, met that target. And yet they've been given all that money for all these houses to build.
Mm-hmm.
From us, by the way, the taxpayer.
Yeah, for the taxpayer.
I'm making a point. And I'm looking a bit annoyed about it. Because it's like they're getting free money, effectively, and they're not even doing what they were meant to be doing for that free money. And there's no accountability, there's no clawback or anything like that, as far as I'm aware. But I used to sit in it. I used to sit in their housing panel at the Fife Housing Partnership for 10 years in the early 2000s, 2000 to 2010. And I used to sit and listen to this all the time as a representative for the private landlords. So I used to hear it all the time, and they never hit their allocations. And they were still going to do it. So you're absolutely right, Ken. It doesn't go to the people that need it. And also affordable housing for people that want to first time buy. Well, how affordable is if it's 5% below the market value? Is it in St Andrews for a first time buyer? It's not, because the market value could be like 350,000. So a first time buyer is going to afford 5% below that.
Yeah, and you see that like the house prices there. I mean, that's sometimes. I mean, you're $250,000 and more for apartments, not just or flats, not houses.
Yeah.
But here's an interesting one. So,
sorry.
No, you're all right. On you go.
Even the East Nuke as well. I've seen personally so many people that I know from that area that they're first-time buyers and they can't touch it because of the market. It's a lot of people that have come from, like, for example, like Edinburgh, purchasing holiday homes. Prices are going up. It's a lovely place to stay. So the prices bump up for it and they can't afford it. So they end up coming along this way, and it's perhaps maybe like leaving that they'll choose to stay or elsewhere because they can't afford to buy in their home area because of the prices.
Yeah. It's a combination of that as well. I've not got any, second homeowners, fair enough. There is an argument for that. Serviced accommodation does provide tourism, constantly filled all the time, all year round. Injection of money every single time, jobs created in the local economy. So there is a sort of argument for that. But definitely the only way to solve that is, what it is, build council housing, build affordable council housing, and get people started off on their first journey. And again, I come back to saying about the generation rent. We are like our rental, the percentage of people that rent with us and generation rent in the UK is something round about. I was looking at this last week. Is what is it, Richard? Round about what, 20% of people? 25.
I was just going to say it's 25.
Yeah.
If I remember
25% of people. Yeah. And yet, when you're abroad, it's a completely different figure. It's something like 70 and 80% that people rent. So
it's a vast
again,
difference.
Different culture. We could all point our finger and look at a different nation and say, "Look how well off they are." But they've got a different dynamic. They interact differently. They pay their taxes differently. They contribute to the society differently. They have a different NHS system, if they've got an NHS system at all. Look at America. It's all people are basically having to choose. You're going to get 20,000 to put that finger, sew that finger back on, and that finger is going to cost you 15,000 to sew back on. So how much have you got? Oh, I've only got 20,000. So which one do you want to sew back on then? and I've seen that.
I mean,
You know,
when you look at it in comparison to places like Italy's healthcare system, America's.
I've seen that Michael Moore's documentary about that, about the American healthcare system, and then looking at other healthcare systems around the world, and then folk was stunned to see that the asthmatic inhalers.
Yeah.
So the inhalers that you pay like $100 for an inhaler in America, and yet you go to Cuba and you get it for $2.
That's great.
And yet they all thought Cuba was actually less prosperous than themselves, and they're getting it for $2. You come here, and guess what? You get it for nothing in Scotland.
Yeah, and places like Italy and things where they've got a good healthcare system, you don't pay for.
So it is easy to point the finger and go, they make a lot of money per person, but you don't realise that they have to pay for everything else themselves out of that.
Yeah.
So their costs are a lot more.
So, I mean, that's really... Yeah, back on topic. So, I mean, Liz Truss has pledged that to help more tenants buy their first homes by stating tenants' rental payments could be used as part of a mortgage affordability assessment. Now, this is important as... Yeah.
Is this woman delusional?
And that is important, as mortgage payments can be around 10-20% lower than rental payments.
But Richard, this is nothing new. This is her on a bandwagon saying that your mortgage payments could be used as a part of an affordability assessment. Mm-hmm. Well, there's news, Liz. You're out of touch, because the reality is it's always been done like that. Because we used to get it all the time, didn't we? We used to get some of the mortgage providers contacting us and saying, could we get you to give us a letter to say if their rental payments and their rental payments were up to date, and if they paid them all on time every time. And we're happy to do that as part of the assessment for their affordability.
If you're using a reputable agent and you are really and got a good track record with paying rental payments on time and things, then but you could definitely use that as a support for your application for a mortgage. Yeah.
So definitely. That's 10 to 20% lower than rental payments. You know, I still argue the fact that you're not doing any repairs, so you've got an older style property you're actually buying. You're not needing to renew heating systems. You're not needing to do carpets. You're not needing to do carpets, curtains. Any roof, anything goes wrong with the roof, anything goes wrong with the plumbing. If you need to replace the kitchen sooner or later, it's someone else that pays for it. It's no you. So there is huge pluses and minuses, but you've got to think for yourself. So tie that in with the relaxed mortgage affordability rules announced by the Bank of England in early August, which was basically the stress testing was taken away. It's no longer applicable. This is undoubtedly a step in the right direction to help generation rent, because there'll be more people will be able to afford mortgages. Now, don't get me wrong here. This is the bank's way of just selling you more mortgages. They're not there to be nice to you. They're there just to find out how they can sell you more mortgages and more lending. Because after all, as soon as they get money in, they lend it out 10 times to other people. They come to people like me and go, how would you like to borrow their money? At a low rate. And it's like, okay, how much are you lending it at? And they're giving them 0.1%, and I'm having to pay something like 0.4%. So I'm having to pay something like 4%, and they're giving them 0.1% or 0.2% on the return. So it just shows you the huge differential in where all the money is made in that scenario. And if they're allowed to lend it out 10 times, the same amount of money for their, I don't know what it is, but just say it's 10 times. Then that's a lot of money they're making on that same money. They're only giving that person 0.2% for.
Yeah.
How do I open my bank? The Bank of Jim. There was actually a boy on telly that did that. The Bank of Dave. He tried to open his own bank. I remember watching the documentary. If you look Bank of Dave, you'll see it in Google. And he tried to have his own. He did his own documentary on television and showed him trying to open a bank. And I tell you what, see the draconian attitude that they had all the other banks towards them. Oh no, you can't call yourself a bank. You have to have regulations, and everybody was down on like a ton of bricks. And they eventually got to the point where you could only really open a credit agency, where you could lend, a consumer credit license. Yeah. You could lend up to £25,000 or under to someone to help them out, but it's only on a consumer credit license. So he really couldn't. He couldn't even call himself bank or anything implied with bank in his name, because it wasn't allowed. It wasn't allowed under the regulations in the law. So let's get back to this.
Okay.
Truss also plans to scrap the red tape holding you back house building and give local populations more say on developments. Not really sure if that's a good thing. everybody on Facebook having a go. Maybe that's no. Hey, everybody's got an opinion, but even idiots have them as well.
Yeah, I think it's good to take everybody's opinion and on board when it's something like that, but to allow too much freedom for the masses.
Yeah. However, when Boris Johnson suggested something similar a few years ago, the policy was quietly dropped after the Liberal Democrats used it against them, resulting in the Tories' resounding by-election defeat in 2021 in Chelmsford and Amersham. So by the end of the first week of September, we'll know who the Prime Minister is. Basically, is it this week? Next week?
Next week.
We'll know who the Prime Minister will be. Whoever gets the job has a gigantic task on their hands. Really, good luck. It's almost.
Housing in itself is such a big task to have.
You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. It's possibly the only career that your ultimate aim is defeat.
Yeah,
I think they all want to give, obviously, all these kind of. I'll say false promises because sometimes they never even come to anything. They'll say, I'll do this, this, and this, and it never happens. So I think it's just. But anyway, I think one of the things that they did actually do, the government, to help first-time buyers was helped buy ISAs. But they've stopped them now.
That was a good thing.
Yeah,
it was, and that was great. So if anybody is watching this and you have an existing Help to Buy ISA, put as much money in that as you can, because that is one of the things that did help me get this house. And it was such a useful thing. Myself had one. Anybody that I spoke to, one of my friends, I was like, please get one, because it was such a useful, helpful thing in this process. And they've stopped doing them. Obviously, if you still have one, it's still a valid account. They will still uphold it, but you can't have any new ones created.
Yeah, you have to get a LISA or something like that. But in order to get a LISA, you've got to be under 40 or something. So you guys will qualify for it, but I won't. Not that I'll need it. But the boys, Ben and Scott have got Help to Buy ISAs. Tony bought her house with Help to Buy ISA. So it was hugely beneficial, and the boys are still putting into it all the time. I think you can only put 200 at the maximum in every month.
Yeah, it's 200 a month that you can put in.
Was it you put in 200 and did they put 50, I think it was?
So they'll give you back a percentage. So however much you've put into your Help to Buy ISA, I can't remember the exact percentage now, but they'll give you back a percentage.
I think you end up getting 25% of the total value, don't you?
Mm-hmm. It was quite good because it made a difference to me, and I used it to pay for effectively a portion of the house. So it's something that they implemented that was beneficial, and now they stopped it. And
at the end of the day, it's free money.
Mm-hmm, yeah, exactly.
I would say so. I would. I'm going to look up LISA's Help to Buy. Just quickly, Help to Buy ISA Scotland. Help to Buy homes. I'm going to pop this in because the Scottish Government has Help to Buy Scotland. The scheme is now closed. The low-cost first-time buyer lift is available to support. So here's the lift in here. So if anybody wants to see the lift one, which is the one at Neil and Perry. I think it was Neil and Perry and myself. Neil Bird from Cara Mortgage Estate.
Oh yeah. It was,
so, that tells that's the lift scheme, low cost initiative for first time buyers. There's the First Home Fund that's not coming back apparently. There's also the LISAs. I'm not really sure if I could see anything about that, but it's easy enough to find online when you look up Help to Buy ISA, because then it says it's closed and it refers you to the LISAs as well. So if anybody's wanting to find out about that as well, and if anybody's needing advice or information about mortgages, more than happy to refer you. Please message us direct on these posts or make a comment and we'll come back to you as well. Thanks very much for coming on the show, guys. Really enjoyed it. Really appreciate your input on this, because obviously you guys are heavily involved in the rental market.
It's a good topic to cover. And I think if whoever the new Prime Minister will be next week, they do really need to take into consideration the generation rent and people that are in that circumstances and include them in the decision-making process. And like you say, Jim, if you are that generation rent and having issues, then click on some of these links here. I'll help you on how to save, or if you want other information, please speak to one else and make a point in the right direction. Or if you're happy renting, we'll rent to you.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Ernie, you want to say anything before we go?
I think it's just an understanding of the landlord provides such an essential part to that housing market, and whoever is going to be the new Prime Minister is going to have their work cut out for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Okay, thanks for coming on the show, guys, and we'll see you next week for the next week's midweek show. Bye-bye for now. Watch out for the Saturday show. What are we doing on Saturday, Richard?
We are doing on Saturday. You did catch me off guard, but
Saturday morning, 9:30. We're doing a letting show. Oh, it's a good one, eh? It's a cracker.
We are doing the thrifty landlord tips this week. So look out for that.
And I tell you what, you know how much I tight get arm. So I'll be telling you out there as a landlord, even as a tenant, how to save as much money as possible and how to maximise your returns as much as possible. Still giving a real good quality service and real good quality accommodation for both, for the tenant and the landlord. So watch out for that show Saturday morning live on these channels at 9:30. Richard and I will be on to talk about that. Okay, bye-bye for now, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jim.